In 1854, the red clay hills of Jefferson County, Alabama, bore witness to events that would remain buried in silence for over a century. The story begins with a discovery made by a graduate student from Auburn University in 1963, while researching antebellum plantation records for her thesis on agricultural labor systems. Hidden beneath layers of dust in the basement of the Jefferson County Historical Society, she found a leather-bound journal wrapped in oiled cloth. The journal belonged to one Martha Elizabeth Thornfield, daughter of plantation owner Cornelius Thornfield of Maple Grove Plantation, located 12 miles southwest of Birmingham along the Cahaba River. The journal entries, written in faded brown ink between 1854 and 1856, tell a story that challenges every assumption about the rigid social hierarchies of the antebellum South. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just what happened to Martha Elizabeth, but how meticulously her father documented his decisions, as if he were conducting an experiment in human behavior rather than destroying his own daughter's life. Cornelius Thornfield owned one of the larger plantations in Jefferson County, with over 300 acres of cotton fields and 47 enslaved individuals. According to the 1850 census, the Thornfield family consisted of Cornelius, age 52, his wife Patience, age 45, and their 3 children, sons William, 24, and Thomas, 21, both managing different sections of the plantation, and Martha Elizabeth, 19. The family lived in a 2-story brick mansion with white columns, built in the Georgian style popular among wealthy planters of the period. By all contemporary accounts, Martha Elizabeth should have been considered a prize among the eligible daughters of Jefferson County's planting class. She was described by family friend Rebecca Morrison as uncommonly intelligent, with dark hair and striking features that commanded attention in any room. She could read Latin, spoke some French, played piano, and had received the finest education available to young women of her class at the Montgomery Female Seminary. However, Martha Elizabeth possessed what her father considered a fatal flaw. She refused every marriage proposal that came her way. In the span of 2 years, she had declined offers from the sons of 3 prominent planting families, including the heir to the massive Riverside plantation and a young man whose family owned iron foundries in Birmingham. Each rejection was polite but firm, accompanied by what witnesses described as a disturbing composure that suggested she found the entire institution of marriage beneath her consideration. The turning point came in March of 1854, when Martha Elizabeth refused what Cornelius considered the most advantageous match yet proposed, marriage to Henry Caldwell, eldest son of Judge Marcus Caldwell, whose plantation bordered theirs to the east. The Caldwell family controlled significant political influence in the county, and the marriage would have secured the Thornfield social position for generations. According to Martha Elizabeth's journal, the conversation with her father took place in his study on the evening of March 15th. Cornelius had summoned her to inform her that she would accept Henry Caldwell's proposal, only to be met with what he later described in his own correspondence as an act of rebellion, so complete that it revealed the unwomanly nature that had been growing like a cancer in my household. Martha Elizabeth had not simply refused the proposal. She had, according to her father's letter to his brother in Mobile, declared her intention never to marry any man, stating that she found the prospect of submission to masculine authority to be incompatible with her nature. In 1854, Alabama, such a statement from a planter's daughter was not merely unconventional. It was a fundamental rejection of the social order that governed their world. Cornelius Thornfield's response was swift and methodical. Within a week of Martha Elizabeth's refusal, he had made a decision that would have shocked their social circle had they known about it. If his daughter refused to fulfill her role as a lady, he would ensure she understood exactly what that meant by showing her the alternative. On March 22, 1854, Martha Elizabeth was moved from her bedroom in the main house to a small cabin behind the kitchen quarters. The cabin, previously used to store farm equipment, was hastily converted with a single bed, a wooden chair, and a basin for washing. More significantly, she was assigned to work alongside the enslaved women who tended the household gardens and preserved food for the plantation. The transition was not announced to the broader community. When asked about Martha Elizabeth's absence from church services and social gatherings, Patience Thornfield told neighbors that her daughter was indisposed with a nervous condition that required rest and seclusion. The story was plausible enough in an era when mysterious female ailments were often blamed on excessive education or an overly sensitive temperament. What makes this case particularly chilling is how Cornelius Thornfield documented his daughter's punishment with the same methodical attention he applied to recording crop yields and livestock breeding. His personal journal, discovered alongside Martha Elizabeth's, reveals a man who believed he was conducting a necessary correction of what he viewed as a dangerous deviation from natural order. According to his entries, Martha Elizabeth was required to rise at 4:30 each morning with the other women assigned to domestic work. She spent her days hoeing vegetables, hauling water, washing clothes in the creek, and preparing meals in the outdoor kitchen during the hottest months of the Alabama summer. Her hands, previously soft from a life of leisure, became cracked and calloused. Her skin darkened from constant exposure to the sun. The psychological dimension of the punishment was equally calculated. Martha Elizabeth ate her meals with the enslaved women, slept in conditions barely better than theirs, and was forbidden from speaking to any member of her family unless directly addressed. She was not allowed to read books, write letters, or engage in any of the intellectual pursuits that had previously defined her daily routine. Perhaps most disturbing was Cornelius's belief that this treatment would eventually break what he saw as his daughter's unnatural spirit. His journal entries from the summer of 1854 show a man convinced that exposure to the realities of life without the protection of masculine authority would inevitably drive Martha Elizabeth to beg for marriage to Henry Caldwell or any other suitable gentleman. However, Martha Elizabeth's own journal tells a different story. Rather than being broken by her circumstances, she began to document what she observed with the sharp eye of someone who had been given an unprecedented view into a world typically hidden from the planter class. Her entries from this period reveal not despair, but a growing understanding of the mechanisms of power that governed plantation society. She wrote detailed observations about the relationships among the enslaved community, noting how they maintained dignity and connection despite the conditions imposed upon them. She recorded conversations she overheard, songs sung during work, and the intricate networks of communication that allowed information to travel across the plantation faster than her father realized. By autumn of 1854, it had become clear that Cornelius's experiment was not producing the intended results. Martha Elizabeth showed no signs of capitulation. If anything, her journal entries suggest that her time in the quarters had reinforced her determination never to submit to marriage. She had seen too clearly how completely a woman's life could be controlled, and had decided that even the relative privilege of her birth was not worth the price of voluntary subjugation. The situation might have continued indefinitely, but for an event that occurred in November of 1854. A traveling preacher named Jeremiah Powell arrived in Jefferson County, conducting revival meetings throughout the area. Powell was known for his passionate sermons about the equality of all souls before God, messages that made some plantation owners uncomfortable, but were tolerated because of his reputation for encouraging moral behavior among enslaved populations. Martha Elizabeth was not permitted to attend the revival meetings, but she could hear the preaching from her cabin when the wind was right. According to her journal, Powell's words about the fundamental dignity of every human being, regardless of earthly circumstances, resonated deeply with what she had observed during her months in the quarters. More significantly, Powell's presence on the plantation provided Martha Elizabeth with an opportunity she had been waiting for. On November 18th, while her father was away on business in Montgomery, she approached the preacher during his visit to conduct services for the enslaved community. The conversation between Martha Elizabeth and Jeremiah Powell was witnessed by several individuals, though their accounts vary in detail. What is consistent across all versions is that Martha Elizabeth asked Powell to help her leave Alabama entirely. She wanted to travel north, to a place where she might live independently without the constant threat of forced marriage or punishment for her refusal to conform. Powell's response was careful and measured. As a traveling preacher, he understood the legal and social constraints that bound everyone in the antebellum South, regardless of their race or class. He could not simply help a planter's daughter disappear without facing serious consequences. However, he also recognized in Martha Elizabeth someone whose spirit had been tested by circumstances that would have broken most people of her class and background. According to Martha Elizabeth's journal, Powell agreed to carry a letter for her to contacts he had among Quaker communities in Pennsylvania. The letter, she wrote, would explain her situation and ask for assistance in establishing herself as a teacher or governess somewhere far from Alabama. In return, Martha Elizabeth promised to provide Powell with information about the routes and timing of slave patrols in Jefferson County, knowledge that might prove useful to others seeking to travel north. The letter was written and passed to Powell on November 23, 1854. Martha Elizabeth's journal entries from this period show a woman who had found new hope, despite the fact that any response would take months to arrive, if it came at all. However, Cornelius Thornfield's return from Montgomery brought devastating news. Through his business contacts, he had learned of Powell's reputation for what some considered dangerous preaching about equality. More troubling still, he had received reports that Powell had been seen speaking privately with Martha Elizabeth during his absence. The confrontation between father and daughter took place on November 27th. Cornelius accused Martha Elizabeth of plotting to escape, a charge she initially denied. However, when her father threatened to have Powell arrested for attempting to steal valuable property, meaning herself, Martha Elizabeth admitted to writing the letter. Cornelius's response revealed the full extent of his rage and desperation. According to Martha Elizabeth's journal, he informed her that she would remain in the quarters permanently until she agreed to marriage. Furthermore, he would ensure that no traveling preacher, teacher, or other outsider would ever have access to her again. She would spend the remainder of her life working alongside enslaved women until she understood the full consequences of rejecting the protection that marriage offered. The winter of 1854 to 1855 was the harshest in recent memory across Alabama. Snow fell several times in Jefferson County, an unusual occurrence that made outdoor work particularly brutal. Martha Elizabeth's journal entries from this period are brief and factual, documenting daily temperatures, work assignments, and the various illnesses that spread through the quarters. What emerges most clearly from these entries is her growing realization that her father's punishment had evolved into something else entirely. Cornelius was no longer trying to break her spirit to force her into marriage. He had begun to see her rejection of conventional womanhood as so fundamental a threat to social order that her permanent removal from respectable society had become the goal itself. By spring of 1855, Martha Elizabeth's transformation was complete, though not in the way her father had intended. Her skin was permanently darkened by sun exposure. Her hands were scarred from manual labor, and her overall appearance had changed so dramatically that she could no longer pass for a member of the planter class. More importantly, her understanding of the mechanisms of oppression had deepened to the point where she began helping other women in the quarters navigate the complex social dynamics that governed their daily lives. The most disturbing aspect of this period was how completely Martha Elizabeth had been erased from the social world she'd been born into. Her former friends assumed she had married quietly or died of some unnamed illness. Her name stopped appearing in the social correspondence that typically tracked the activities of prominent families. For all practical purposes, Martha Elizabeth Thornfield had simply vanished. The first hint that Martha Elizabeth's story might become known to the outside world came in the form of a letter that arrived at Maple Grove Plantation in June of 1855. The letter, addressed to Martha Elizabeth personally, bore a Philadelphia postmark and contained a response to her request for assistance in relocating north. The letter had been written by a Quaker woman named Sarah Pemberton, who explained that her community would be willing to provide Martha Elizabeth with shelter and employment as a teacher in a school they operated for the children of former slaves who had found freedom in Pennsylvania. The letter included detailed instructions for reaching Philadelphia and the name of a conductor on what was euphemistically called the Underground Railroad. Cornelius intercepted the letter, as he intercepted all mail arriving at the plantation. His response was swift and decisive. Rather than simply destroying the correspondence, he decided to use it as evidence of what he considered his daughter's criminal conspiracy with abolitionists. On June 23, 1855, Cornelius Thornfield filed a formal complaint with the Jefferson County Sheriff, alleging that his daughter had been corresponding with known abolitionists and had attempted to provide them with information about local slave patrols. The complaint requested that Martha Elizabeth be investigated for seditious activity and, if necessary, confined to prevent further contact with enemies of the state. The sheriff, Benjamin Crawford, was in a difficult position. Cornelius Thornfield was one of the most influential men in the county, and his allegation was serious. However, investigating a planter's daughter for abolitionist sympathies was unprecedented and politically dangerous. After consulting with Judge Marcus Caldwell, the father of the young man whose proposal had started the entire affair, Crawford decided to conduct a quiet inquiry rather than a formal investigation. The inquiry consisted primarily of interviews with the enslaved individuals who worked closest to Martha Elizabeth. Crawford's questions focused on whether she had asked unusual questions about local geography, patrol schedules, or routes north. The interviews were conducted in the presence of Cornelius Thornfield, which ensured that no enslaved person would dare provide information that might incriminate Martha Elizabeth. However, the very act of conducting the inquiry had achieved Cornelius's actual goal. Word of the investigation spread quickly through Jefferson County's close-knit planter society. The rumor that Martha Elizabeth Thornfield was under suspicion for abolitionist activities effectively destroyed any possibility that she might eventually return to respectable society, even if she agreed to marriage. By the end of summer 1855, Martha Elizabeth's position had become impossible in multiple ways. She could not return to her former life, could not marry into her own social class, and could not leave Alabama without facing arrest for sedition. Her father had succeeded in creating a situation where she existed in a kind of social limbo, neither free nor enslaved, neither lady nor outcast, but something unprecedented in the social order of the antebellum South. The psychological pressure of this impossible position began to show in Martha Elizabeth's journal entries from the autumn of 1855. For the first time since her punishment began, she wrote about feelings of despair and confusion. The strength that had carried her through months of physical hardship was being eroded by the realization that her father had found a way to imprison her more completely than any cell could have achieved. The breaking point came in October of 1855, when Martha Elizabeth learned that Henry Caldwell had become engaged to another young woman. The engagement meant that even if she capitulated completely to her father's demands, the marriage that had started the entire conflict was no longer available. Cornelius had destroyed her life to force her into a union that no longer existed. According to her journal, Martha Elizabeth spent several days in what she described as a darkness of mind that felt like drowning while still breathing. However, rather than leading to surrender, this despair ultimately produced a kind of clarity. She realized that her father's actions had freed her from any obligation to consider his wishes or feelings. She was going to escape, regardless of the consequences. The plan she developed was simple but dangerous. On the night of November 15th, 1855, during the new moon, when visibility would be lowest, Martha Elizabeth would leave the plantation and attempt to reach the Tennessee border. She had saved what little money came her way and had memorized the routes described in Sarah Pemberton's letter. Most importantly, she had observed that the slave patrols in Jefferson County followed predictable patterns that could be avoided by someone willing to travel slowly and carefully. However, Martha Elizabeth made one critical error in her planning. She confided her intentions to a woman named Rose, who worked alongside her in the quarters and whom she had come to consider a friend. Martha Elizabeth believed that Rose shared her desire for freedom and would either help with the escape or at least remain silent about it. What Martha Elizabeth did not understand was that Rose faced an impossible choice. If she helped Martha Elizabeth escape and the plan failed, Rose would face punishment that could include sale away from her own children who lived on the plantation. If she remained silent and the escape was discovered later, she would be suspected of complicity anyway. Rose's only safe option was to report Martha Elizabeth's plan to the overseer. On November 14th, 1855, the day before her planned escape, Martha Elizabeth was summoned to the main house for the first time in over a year and a half. She found her father waiting in his study, along with Sheriff Crawford and Judge Caldwell. The three men had decided that Martha Elizabeth's behavior had progressed beyond family discipline into criminal activity that threatened the stability of the entire county. The conversation that followed was recorded in Sheriff Crawford's official report, which was discovered in the Jefferson County archives during the 1960s. According to Crawford's account, Martha Elizabeth was informed that she would be confined indefinitely in the county jail on charges of seditious conspiracy and attempted flight. The charges were serious enough to justify permanent imprisonment, effectively ending any possibility of escape or return to society. Martha Elizabeth's response was described by all three men as unnaturally calm. She neither begged for mercy nor protested the charges. Instead, she asked a single question, whether her confinement would be permanent or whether she would eventually face trial. When informed that a trial would depend on her willingness to provide information about her abolitionist contacts, she simply nodded and said she understood. The transfer to the Jefferson County Jail took place on November 16, 1855. Martha Elizabeth was placed in a cell typically used to confine runaway slaves awaiting return to their owners. The cell contained a straw mattress, a bucket for waste, and a small window too high and narrow to provide any view of the outside world. What makes Martha Elizabeth's imprisonment particularly disturbing was its completely extrajudicial nature. She had never been formally charged with a crime, never appeared before a judge, and had no legal representation. Her confinement was justified entirely by her father's allegation of seditious activity, an allegation that was never tested in court. The conditions of her imprisonment were deliberately harsh, designed to break her will and force her to confess to abolitionist activities that would justify her continued confinement. She was fed once a day, usually cornbread and water, with occasional additions of pork fat or vegetables. She was not allowed books, writing materials, or visitors other than her father and the county officials. However, the most psychologically devastating aspect of her imprisonment was its uncertainty. Martha Elizabeth was never told how long she would be confined or what she could do to secure her release. She existed in a state of permanent suspension, neither free nor sentenced, neither alive nor dead in any meaningful social sense. The first indication that Martha Elizabeth's story might eventually become public knowledge came from an unexpected source. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the county physician who was occasionally called to treat prisoners, began visiting Martha Elizabeth in early 1856. Morrison was the husband of Rebecca Morrison, the family friend who had previously described Martha Elizabeth's intelligence and beauty. Dr. Morrison's initial visits were prompted by concerns about Martha Elizabeth's physical health after months of poor nutrition and confinement. However, he quickly realized that her mental state was of greater concern. The woman he found in the Jefferson County Jail bore little resemblance to the vibrant young woman he had known from social gatherings. According to Morrison's private medical notes, which were donated to the Alabama Medical Association archives in 1967, Martha Elizabeth showed signs of what would now be recognized as severe depression and trauma. She had lost significant weight, her hair had begun falling out, and she exhibited what Morrison described as a detachment from present circumstances that suggested her mind had retreated to some internal sanctuary beyond the reach of external suffering. More significantly, Morrison began to question the legal and medical justification for Martha Elizabeth's continued imprisonment. In his notes, he wrote that she showed no signs of the criminal insanity that might justify indefinite confinement, nor did she exhibit the political fanaticism that her father claimed had made her a threat to social order. Instead, Morrison saw a young woman who had been systematically destroyed by circumstances that no one seemed capable of controlling or resolving. Morrison's growing concern led him to take an unprecedented step. In March of 1856, he wrote a confidential letter to Dr. William Pratt, a physician and legal scholar at the University of Alabama, describing Martha Elizabeth's case and asking for guidance on the legal and ethical issues involved. Dr. Pratt's response, which survived in Morrison's personal papers, was both illuminating and disturbing. According to Pratt, Martha Elizabeth's situation existed in a legal gray area that reflected the fundamental contradictions of antebellum Southern society. As a white woman, she possessed certain protections under law, but as a daughter, she remained subject to paternal authority that was essentially unlimited. Her alleged seditious activities placed her outside the normal protections afforded to women of her class, but she had never been formally convicted of any crime. Pratt's analysis concluded that Martha Elizabeth was trapped in a situation that had no legal resolution within the existing system. She could not be freed without her father's consent, but her father had every incentive to maintain her imprisonment indefinitely. She could not be formally tried without evidence of specific criminal acts, but she could be held indefinitely on suspicion of seditious intent. In effect, she had become a non-person, existing outside the legal and social structures that defined life in antebellum Alabama. This legal limbo continued through the spring and summer of 1856. Martha Elizabeth remained in the Jefferson County Jail, her existence known only to a small circle of officials who had become increasingly uncomfortable with the situation but saw no way to resolve it. Her mother, Patience Thornfield, had made several attempts to visit her daughter, but had been turned away by her husband, who maintained that any contact with family would undermine the corrective purpose of her confinement. The end of Martha Elizabeth's imprisonment came not through legal resolution or family reconciliation, but through the intervention of forces beyond anyone's control. In September of 1856, a cholera outbreak swept through Jefferson County, affecting both the enslaved population and the white community. The disease reached the county jail in early October, and Martha Elizabeth was among its victims. Dr. Morrison's final medical note, dated October 12, 1856, recorded that Martha Elizabeth died during the night after 4 days of illness. She was 21 years old and had spent nearly 2.5 years in various forms of confinement. Morrison noted that her physical condition had been so weakened by imprisonment that she had little resistance to the disease. The burial arrangements revealed the complete extent to which Martha Elizabeth had been erased from respectable society. Cornelius Thornfield refused to have her body returned to the family cemetery at Maple Grove Plantation, stating that she had forfeited her right to lie among virtuous members of the Thornfield family. Instead, she was buried in an unmarked grave in the Potter's Field section of the county cemetery, alongside paupers and unknown travelers. No funeral service was held, and no death notice appeared in local newspapers. For all practical purposes, Martha Elizabeth Thornfield simply vanished from the historical record, as completely as if she had never existed. Her mother was not permitted to attend the burial, and her brothers, who had remained silent throughout her ordeal, showed no interest in acknowledging her death. The immediate aftermath of Martha Elizabeth's death was characterized by a conspiracy of silence that involved everyone who had knowledge of her case. Sheriff Crawford filed a brief report noting the death of a prisoner from cholera, but provided no details about the circumstances of her imprisonment. Judge Caldwell made no official comment on a case that had never come before his court. Dr. Morrison completed his medical records, but made no effort to publicize the disturbing circumstances he had observed. Most significantly, Cornelius Thornfield behaved as if Martha Elizabeth had died years earlier, when she first refused to marry Henry Caldwell. He never spoke of her again, and gradually removed all evidence of her existence from the family home. Her portrait was taken down, her belongings were burned or given away, and her name was omitted from family correspondence and official documents. However, the conspiracy of silence was not complete. Dr. Morrison retained his medical notes and correspondence about Martha Elizabeth's case, apparently troubled by what he had witnessed. More importantly, Martha Elizabeth's journal and her father's own records of her punishment survived in the family papers that were eventually donated to the Jefferson County Historical Society. The rediscovery of these documents in 1963 provided the first complete account of what had happened to Martha Elizabeth Thornfield. The graduate student who found them, Sarah Catherine Mitchell, was so disturbed by what she read that she initially considered the journals to be fictional accounts rather than historical records. Only when she cross-referenced the names and dates with other plantation records did she realize she had uncovered one of the most disturbing cases of family violence in Alabama history. Mitchell's research revealed that Martha Elizabeth's story was not unique in its basic elements, but rather represented an extreme example of the pressures faced by women who challenged the social expectations of antebellum Southern society. Other young women had been disowned, confined to asylums, or forced into marriages against their will for similar acts of rebellion. What made Martha Elizabeth's case exceptional was the methodical way her destruction had been documented and the complete absence of any effective intervention by legal or social institutions. The broader implications of Martha Elizabeth's story became clear as Mitchell continued her research. In a society that claimed to venerate and protect white womanhood, a planter's daughter could be systematically destroyed by her own father with no legal recourse and minimal social consequence. The same system that justified slavery by claiming the need to protect white women from violence had no mechanism to protect those women from the men who claimed to be their protectors. Mitchell's thesis, completed in 1964, was the first academic treatment of Martha Elizabeth's case. However, the thesis was never published, and Mitchell's faculty advisor reportedly discouraged her from pursuing the topic further. The official explanation was that the case was too isolated to support broader conclusions about antebellum society, but colleagues later suggested that the real concern was the inflammatory nature of the material in an era of civil rights tensions. The documents themselves were quietly transferred from the Jefferson County Historical Society to the Alabama Department of Archives and History in Montgomery, where they remained largely unexamined for several more years. A note attached to the file indicated that access required approval from the director, effectively limiting scholarly research on the case. The final chapter in Martha Elizabeth's story came in 1968, when the archives building in Montgomery suffered damage during a fire that started in an adjacent structure. While no major collections were lost, several boxes of documents were damaged by smoke and water. Among these was the file containing Martha Elizabeth's journal and her father's records, which were deemed too deteriorated for public access and were placed in restricted storage. According to the archive's internal records, the Martha Elizabeth Thornfield file was officially classified as unavailable for research purposes due to conservation concerns. No preservation efforts were funded, and the documents were gradually forgotten as newer acquisitions took priority and staff changes eliminated institutional memory of the case. Today, more than a century after Martha Elizabeth's death, her story exists only in the fragmentary notes of researchers who examined the documents before they became inaccessible. The exact location of her grave remains unknown, as the Potter's Field section of the Jefferson County Cemetery was later developed for commercial use with no effort to relocate the remains buried there. The Maple Grove plantation itself passed out of Thornfield family ownership in 1868, when Cornelius's debts following the Civil War forced him to sell the property. The mansion was demolished in the early 1900s to make way for industrial development, leaving no physical trace of the family that had once lived there. Perhaps most disturbing is how completely Martha Elizabeth's story has been erased from the collective memory of Jefferson County. Local histories make no mention of her case, and the Thornfield family name appears only in routine genealogical records that provide no hint of the tragedy that destroyed one of its members. The very mechanisms that enabled her persecution, paternal authority, social conformity, and institutional indifference have also ensured that her suffering remains invisible to history. The few scholars who have attempted to research Martha Elizabeth's case have encountered a consistent pattern of missing records, misfiled documents, and institutional obstacles that suggest a continuing reluctance to confront the disturbing implications of her story. The question remains whether this reluctance reflects mere bureaucratic inefficiency or something more deliberate. A recognition that some stories are too dangerous to tell, even more than a century after the events they describe. In the end, Martha Elizabeth Thornfield's life serves as a reminder that the most effective forms of oppression are often those that eliminate their victims so completely that their stories cannot be told. She was destroyed not by dramatic violence, but by the patient application of legal, social, and familial authority that left her with no recourse and no witnesses willing to speak on her behalf. Her journal entries, written in the dim light of a slave cabin and later a county jail cell, represent one of the most direct accounts we have of what it meant to be a woman who refused to accept the limitations imposed by antebellum Southern society. That these documents have now been lost to official neglect rather than deliberate suppression somehow makes their disappearance even more troubling. A final erasure that reduces Martha Elizabeth to nothing more than a footnote in a graduate student's thesis that was never published. The red clay hills of Jefferson County continue to hold their secrets, and the Cahaba River flows past the site where Maple Grove Plantation once stood. But the silence that surrounds Martha Elizabeth Thornfield's story is not the natural quiet of historical distance. It is the cultivated silence of a society that continues to prefer comfortable myths to inconvenient truths about the mechanisms of power and the price of resistance. And yet, in 1969, a final piece of Martha Elizabeth's story emerged from an unexpected source. During the demolition of an old warehouse in downtown Birmingham, construction workers discovered a cache of letters hidden in the building's foundation. The warehouse had been built on the site of the former county jail, and the letters had apparently been concealed by someone with access to the building during its original construction. Among the letters was a single page in Martha Elizabeth's handwriting, dated November 14th, 1855, the day before her planned escape and subsequent imprisonment. The letter was addressed to Sarah Pemberton, the Quaker woman in Philadelphia who had offered her sanctuary. In it, Martha Elizabeth wrote that she understood her attempt to reach freedom would likely fail, but that she preferred to die trying than to continue existing in the limbo her father had created for her. The letter concluded with a request that if anything happened to her, someone should remember that she had chosen resistance over submission, even knowing the cost. She wrote, "I have learned that there are forms of slavery that do not require chains, and forms of freedom that cannot be taken away even by death. If my story serves any purpose, let it be to remind others that the choice between dignity and safety is sometimes the only choice that truly belongs to us." The construction workers who found the letters turned them over to the Birmingham Historical Society, where they were catalogued but never displayed. The Society's board determined that the materials were too controversial for public exhibition, particularly given the racial tensions of the era. The letters were eventually transferred to a private collector who specialized in Civil War-era documents. When the collector died in 1974, his estate was sold at auction, and the letters disappeared into the hands of unknown buyers who may not have understood their significance. Today, Martha Elizabeth Thornfield's name appears in no history books, no monument marks her grave, and no archive contains a complete record of her ordeal. She has become what her father intended her to become, a non-person whose existence can be neither confirmed nor denied by those who prefer not to acknowledge what happened to her. But perhaps that silence itself is the most fitting monument to her story. In a world where power structures survive by erasing evidence of their victims, the very absence of Martha Elizabeth's voice becomes a testament to the forces that destroyed her. The empty spaces in the historical record mark the places where inconvenient truths have been carefully removed, leaving gaps that sensitive observers can learn to recognize and interpret. The red clay of Jefferson County still holds its secrets, and the Cahaba River continues its flow toward the sea. Somewhere beneath the suburban developments and shopping centers that now cover the landscape, the bones of a young woman rest in unmarked earth, carrying with them the memory of a choice that was both futile and absolutely necessary. And in the end, that may be the most disturbing truth of all. That Martha Elizabeth Thornfield's story is not a historical curiosity from a distant past, but a reminder of how easily inconvenient people can be made to disappear, how completely resistance can be punished, and how thoroughly silence can be maintained when it serves the interests of those with power. The echoes of her refusal still resonate in the spaces between the official records, in the gaps where her name should appear, and in the careful omissions that mark the boundaries of what any society is willing to remember about itself. Until today, no one has been willing to tell her story completely, and perhaps, in its very telling, we can finally offer Martha Elizabeth Thornfield what was denied to her in life, the simple acknowledgement that she existed, that she chose resistance over submission, and that her destruction was not an accident of history, but a deliberate act by those who could not tolerate the challenge she represented to their carefully ordered world.